Good morning, and welcome back to this Bible study as we look at the scriptures that we're using for our worship. And we begin a new series today, Mighty Mentors. But before we get to that, I need to go back and take care of a little bit of unfinished business from last week when we were looking at I Am the Vine, and we were talking about roots. And I mentioned a church that I had heard about where the pastor grew it from about 150 down to less than 50 before the church started to grow. I had the setting, the details right, but the setting was all wrong. The church was Gingensburg United Methodist Church in, I believe, Tripp, Ohio. And the pastor, who's now retired, was Michael Slaughter in that church. But today we move on to our new series, Mighty Mentors, looking at biblical stories of people who have either been mentored or mentors themselves and what they have done for other people. And today we look at Moses and some advice that he got from his father-in-law. And the scripture we have is from Exodus, the 18th chapter, the 10th through the 24th verses. Jethro, and that being Moses' father-in-law, said, "Bless the Lord who has rescued you from the Egyptians' power and from the Pharaoh's power, who rescued the people from Egypt's oppressive power. Now I know that the Lord is greater than all the gods because of what happened when the Egyptians plotted against them." Then Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, brought an entirely burned offering and sacrifices to God. Aaron came with all of Israel's elders to eat a meal with Moses' father-in-law in God's presence. The next day, Moses sat as a judge for the people, while the people stood around Moses from morning until evening. When Moses' father-in-law saw all that he was doing for the people, he said, "What's this that you are doing for the people? Why do you sit alone while all the people are standing around you from morning to evening?" Moses said to his father-in-law, "Because the people come to me to inquire of God. When a conflict arises between them, they come to me, and I judge between the two of them. I also teach them God's regulations and instructions." Moses' father-in-law said to him, "What you are doing isn't good. You will end up totally wearing yourself out, both you and these people who are with you. The work is too difficult for you. You can't do it alone. Now listen to me, and let me give you some advice, and may God be with you. Your role should be to represent the people before God. You should bring their disputes before God yourself. Explain the regulations and instructions to them. Let them know the way they are supposed to go and the things they are supposed to do." That's the advice that Jethro gave to his son-in-law, Moses. Some backstory to set the stage here, put it into context. I think we all know the story of Moses being cast adrift in a basket in the Nile River, being rescued by Pharaoh's daughter and raised as her son in Pharaoh's household. And then later, as an adult, Moses observes the Egyptian guards beating his fellow Jewish laborers. And it was more than he could stand, and he took a rock and he killed the guard and tried to hide the body, but it was not unnoticed. And when Moses realized that what he had done was known to other people, he fled out of Egypt into the land of Midian and stayed there for 40 years before going back to rescue the Israelite people under God's leadership. They have come out of Egypt. They are in the desert, having crossed over the Red Sea, and are in the desert trying to get their act together to go on into the promised land. That's the setting that we come to today's scripture. Moses and the people were in the desert, trying, as I said, to get their act together to move on. Now, there's a couple things here that stand out to me. The first is when we read this story, I think that often we think of the Israelite people being out there and nobody knowing where they were. And we see that that's not true at the beginning of the 18th chapter, because it says that Jethro, Midian's priest, and Moses' father-in-law heard about everything that God had done for Moses and for God's people Israel, and how the Lord had brought Israel out of Egypt. It goes on to say that Jethro takes Moses' wife and his 2 sons out into the desert to where Moses is at. So they're not out there where people don't know that they're there. That larger group of people, even with the primitive communications that they had of that day, you just don't hide that many people, even out in the desert. There are various numbers attributed to the number of Israelites that were out there. Just suffice it to say, it was a big crowd of people that were out there. So their presence was not unknown, their location was not unknown. And Jethro comes to Moses, and he observes what's going on out there. It goes on to say that Moses is trying to deal with all of this all by himself. You'll recall that when God first came to Moses, Moses said he couldn't do this. And God said, don't worry, I'll give you help. And he did provide help. He provided help in the form of his brother, Aaron, who was your interpreter, so to speak, for speaking to Pharaoh on Moses' behalf. But we get to here, and we don't see that Moses is using Aaron in any shape or form. So he's got one helper there that God set aside, and Moses is not using him. There are disputes, and they come to Moses to have these disputes settled. And Jethro tells Moses, if you continue to do this, you're flat going to burn out. Now, that's something that I think that many of us today are coming to grips with. We've been in this pandemic for a year and a half now, about 18 months. And when you look at the news accounts, you see that people are just quitting their jobs, saying that they've had enough. I was reading a story this morning trying to explain why people were leaving their jobs. And predominantly, it's people who are interacting with the population at large, restaurant workers, nurses, are two of the groups where people are leaving the profession in record numbers, saying they've just had enough. They can't do it anymore. And so they've gone on to try either something else or to do nothing, just trying to make a way for themselves. So burnout is something that we're acquainted with either personally or through observing what's going on in our society around us. And Jethro tells Moses, you got to do something different. And he offers up a plan to take some of your most trustworthy, faithful followers, educate them, teach them the things that you're trying to teach the larger number of people. Take this smaller group and teach them, and then give them the authority to go out and to settle the minor disputes, and save the more difficult disputes. Let those come to you. It's interesting to observe that that's the same system that our judicial system here in the United States is set up. We have the Supreme Court that is reserved for the most difficult and most complex issues. And then you have the lower courts that feed into the Supreme Court, who make the less complex decisions along the way. That's the setting. That's what's happening here. A couple other tidbits. Who is Jethro? He's introduced to us back in the second chapter of Exodus, and Moses has found himself there and has intervened on behalf of Jethro's daughters. He had 7 daughters, and they took care of his sheep. They had gone to the well and were chased away by the other shepherds, and Moses intervened and in fact chased the other shepherds off so that Jethro's daughters could get the water they needed for their sheep. And when they returned home early because Moses had intervened, that's when a meeting is set up between Jethro and Moses. He's a Midianite priest. The Midianites, as you go on through the Old Testament, you see that there was not always harmony. In fact, there was a lot of animosity between the Hebrew people and the Midianite people. In a very real sense, they were Gentiles, not unlike the Samaritans of Jesus' day. But they had a belief that they understood who God was, and they had a system of worship that worshiped God. In the second chapter of Exodus, verse 18, Jethro is referred to as Reuel, R-E-U-E-L, which is a word that means friend of God. He was not only a priest, but he was referred to as a friend of God. The Midianites were one of the characteristics of their worship was that they worshiped Yahweh. And you'll know that as you go on through the Old Testament, that's a name that God is referred to many times. Having just finished the I am sayings in the Gospel of John, you might find it interesting that a literal translation of the word Yahweh is I am. And God is referred to sometimes when he's asked who he is, that is God's answer, I am. I just found that interesting, so I pass that on to you. But we get to the heart of the matter. The advice not the advice, but the fact that Jethro intervenes with Moses and takes him under his wing and provides some advice to help make his life easier. Through this series, we'll be looking at other people who have done that. But this has made me think about, in my own life, to go back and think about the times that I have been mentored. And there are numerous occasions of people that I could point to that had an effect in my life. Not so much as mentoring, but one of the few interactions that I had with my father-in-law, when Jenny and I started dating, he had was suffering from cancer, and before we were married, he died. But the first date that we had, somehow or another, I ended up in the living room with just her father there. And he kind of smiled and he said, when they bring out the photo albums, it's either time to leave if you're going to leave or stay if you're going to stay. That's just always stuck with me. But a mentor that, as a teenager, who was influential in my life was the shop teacher at our high school, Clarence Rohde. He was older than most of the teachers there. Our high school was in the northern part of Baltimore County in Maryland, and was comprised of an area not unlike what we have here in Bedford, where we had a lot of regional high schools. That's what we had in Maryland. And there were 4 other high schools that had fed into the high school that I went to. Um, and the southernmost of those schools was also the school that I went to elementary school, Sparks Elementary, which is no longer in existence, having burned several years ago. But when that was a high school, he taught shop there, and in fact taught one of my uncles, my mother's youngest brother, in high school there. Um, I found myself in his shop class um, among a bunch of other people who some would call juvenile delinquents. Um, they were there strictly because it was an easy class that didn't have any homework and they really didn't have to do anything. There were 2 of us in the class that actually were there because we wanted to be there in the shop class. The other boy, Lewis Schaefer, um, he went on to open his own cabinet shop after he graduated from high school. But for some reason that I never understood, Mr. Rohde took me under his wing um, and gave me projects and taught me things that he didn't take time to do with the other boys in the class. Um, he taught me how to use equipment safely. And I still, every time I use my table saw, I still remember what he taught me, that when you're pushing a board through, ripping it, to always put your finger, your little finger, over the rip fence. So you're holding your hand away from the saw blade. And every time I just do it as an automatic reflex now. Stick my hand down like that, and I think of Mr. Rohde. Um, Between my junior and senior year in high school, he hired me to come down to his orchard. Last week we were talking about vines and pruning. Well, he had an apple orchard, um, and he hired me to prune his trees and work in his orchard. Now, unlike my grandfather, who was very particular about how you pruned a tree, when Mr. Rohde took me up into the orchard, he just told me, cut some branches off. That was literally all he told me. He said, there need to be less branches than what there are now, and just climb up in the tree and cut them off. And he gave me some a pruning saw and some pruning shears and left me up there to hack branches off the trees. Um, he had a great impact on my life. Like I said, he taught me how to use equipment safely. He helped me learn how to do some basic cabinetry. He also provided, when I didn't have the money for my senior project, I wanted to build a cedar chest. And the top of the line, what everybody that really wanted, if you really wanted to build a cedar chest, you wanted to do it out of walnut. I couldn't afford the wood, the walnut wood. And he took me over into the storage cabinet, and he said, I know you wanted walnut, but he pulled out this board, I believe it was aspen. It's a light colored wood that under varnish has turned sort of a yellowish color over the years. And he pulled this out. He said, I can give you this. And he said, he showed me the burl that was in it. He said, this will make a nice cedar chest. And so that's the cedar chest that I built for my senior project under his guidance that my mother had for all these years, and she passed it back to me, and it's in our bedroom right now. As we continue on, I know I've been doing all the talking this morning, but I'm going to give you a homework assignment. As we continue over the next few weeks, I would like for you all who are sitting here with me to share your own experiences where somebody has mentored you in your life, and what the wisdom that they imparted to you was, and what that has meant to you. So, can you all do that? Nah, sure you can. I know you can, Roger.
I am.
Yeah. So that's the first of our mighty mentors, and we're looking at Moses and his relationship with his father-in-law Jethro, and how Jethro is giving him advice to make his life easier and to prevent it from burning out. Look forward to being here as we continue on with this series and see where it'll take us. And look forward to seeing you at worship this morning as we listen to Pastor Dawn, and she opens this series and shares her insights with Moses and his father-in-law. Thank you for joining us.